going to travel tomorrow. Welcome in the Cafe Nightly Show. It is Thursday, the 15th of February, and I'm just playing a little bit of catch up here with a couple bits of pieces that have been going on for a little bit, and not playing, or actually a little bit of a lull that we have in between things. There is a hiatus, or at least I'm just going to call it a hiatus. No official announcements today. No real pushes forward that we need to worry about too much. There is a cart snapshot for the Monster Mayhem and the Tiny Monsters carts that is going to be taking place on Monday. So people have on Tuesday. So people have a little bit of time to move around, buy those cards, sell those cards if they choose to do so. We've gone over some of those details already, but I do want to take a rewind, to recap a quick look at Totems. And that's because people now have the opportunity to decide what they want to do, if they want to change, exchange, trade, buy, sell. The starting Totem, there are a couple ways you can acquire it. Upland did have a sale previously. They will have a sale again, I'm sure. So there are ways to get in and get started with Totems. So worth having that evaluation now. There's people who didn't participate in the first cycle for one reason or the other. Love to see those people get in and get involved in cycle 2. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to roll that back a little bit without the big broad numbers, without getting too much in the weeds, but looking at a couple resources. And the easiest ones are just understanding the overall function format and what the realistic takeaways are from the Totems. So getting started on that, obviously all views and opinions expressed by myself are mine and mine alone. Shouldn't be taken as game strategy advice or financial advice. They don't represent the game or the team of Upland. And just to jump right into it, if you are following along on YouTube, you're watching the YouTube video, thank you so much for doing so. Again, usually we have the announcements. Usually it's what Upland has said, plus a little bit of context along the way. Now is a full review of something that has been gone over dozens of times. I've gone over it dozens of times, but it is a good opportunity at this time in between to at least have that pause for thought. And on Totems, the easiest thing that you can do for pause for thought here is to review from the beginning. And the review from the beginning on Totems is pretty simple. Upland put out one of the better guides that they have ever done on Totems. They updated it. They built it out. They made it more than it was in the beginning. And I'm sharing it right now on Discord. On Discord, you're not going to see this. Discord, anybody in Discord, you can go to guides.upland.me to see this. I'm going to drop that actually in Discord as well, that link. But the easiest thing is, this is the best all-in-one place guide that Upland's ever put out for anything they've done. It is one of the easiest ways to get in, to review, and to see what your options are. And before we had somebody telling us feed now, feed this many hours, it was the easiest way to see or to try to look at what timing might be, and scaling, and what's more likely the longest scale, the shortest scale, the highest feed, the lowest feed. And we did learn things along the way, of course. So just taking it right from the beginning, we have totem traits. Totems have a total of 5 traits. The 5 traits are your output, your input, your frequency, your capacity, and your stamina. Those 5 traits are determined by a visual trait. Again, I should actually call the output, input, frequency, capacity, and stamina the attributes. They are what affects the overall function and feature of your totem, how you put Protem in, how you get Protem out. The visual traits that represent those attributes are life form, style, color, scale, and totem base. Pretty simple. This has all been kind of collated and put together based on what happened the first cycle by a couple of third-party developers. I will get into one of those tools because, again, if it can be made easy, let's make it easy. Keep in mind, the cycle 2 is going to be different than cycle 1. I expect there to be some modification in one way, shape, or form. We might see a modification of the required inputs, and we'll get into how that's determined. And we might also see a couple other modifications. Keeping in mind, stamina was not, capacity was not in play the first cycle. It's supposed to be turned on. It's supposed to be key in play the second cycle, according to Upland. So that is going to change the game a little bit as well. But for the basics, obviously we are looking at input and output being the most important here. Output was what was keeping people crazy the entire cycle long, and because it wasn't something that was easily defined. It wasn't something that even those who had the calculations, who were doing the calculations, who were telling people this is the ideal amount you have to feed, this is the timing you have to feed, they didn't know exactly how things were on the curve. The curve is each life form had a curve of its own. There was a couple different versions of curves, and then different life forms had their own iteration of that curve type. The curve types were linear, hockey stick, wave, sharp step, mild step, and static llama. The static llama, go figure, there's only one of. It doesn't matter unless you own that llama. That llama was won. It was won at Genesis Week 2023. It was won by King Conroy, a.k.a. Cafe Mogador, and he held on to it. So that wasn't something you had to worry about. But everything else, you are getting a different amount of Totem out, depending on where you are in that cycle. So the cycle is broken into different intervals. Each interval, you're going to have a optimal feed period. And then at the end of the cycle, when that cycle has come to an end, that's when you have your output. That's when you get a payout for that particular cycle. That's the way things were set up in the cycle one. We continue to likely see that be the case. Again, in each of the intervals along the way, you have one input, one output. You go into your next interval, one input, one output throughout the entire cycle. And with there being this different payout on this output determined by the curve, we were ending up heavily with the profitability being kind of couched here, pushed along the way, centered heavily towards the end of the cycle. This was the case along the way, some more extreme than others, all except for the static llama, of course. So the linear, your rewards grow constantly over time. Think of this as essentially, if you're looking at a graph, you've got a linear rate of ascent here. You make a little bit more in interval 2 than you made in interval 1. In interval 5, you obviously make more than you made in interval 2. Pretty simple. We have the hockey stick method or the hockey stick curve, and for that, or to look at that archetype, you're essentially saying you're taking a loss, you're taking a loss, you're taking a loss, you're taking a loss right along almost every interval until you get to the last few, and then it's going to skyrocket. We saw this with our friend the cheetah. That's what one of the things that killed me is I had a cheetah that I fed throughout most of the cycle, and we'll get into penalties. Penalties made it inoperable before the end of the cycle, and I would have had to get it to almost the very end before I started seeing any profit, or I started seeing any interval with profit. And then obviously I would have to take it to close to the end to have a profit that makes up for the loss in the beginning of the cycle. That is kind of the way this game is built. The game loop that's built here is you have to avoid the penalties, because if you accrue penalties early in the cycle, you are going to be locked out of the profitable intervals towards the end. Again, it is an intentional game loop that's rewarding people from being darn near perfect from day one. And luckily, there was enough room there to still profit, even with a little bit of failure, that most of us were very profitable throughout the cycle. Looking at the wave goes up and down. What we learned about the wave, and again, this is learning through feature of the first cycle, caveat being things could change, but learning through the first cycle is the way the wave function worked is you go from being at a loss, and then going up and obviously breaking the line of what I'm reading here and actually starting to make a little bit of profit, being above the input. So you have interval 1, 2, 3, 4. You may be putting the same amount in. Let's say you put 20 Totem in each interval. You may have 5 Totem come out the first interval. Maybe you have 6 the second, 7 the third, and at a certain point, it may be more than that 20 input, and then it's going to start going up and up and up until it gets to the apex of that curve, of the crest of that wave function, and then it's going to come back down. And what we had luckily is that didn't end up coming to a full trough below the loss. It didn't come all the way down to a loss again. It came down towards a point where it was approaching about a break-even point. It was getting close to the amount of input, and then it came back up again. So even though it's a wave function, it is a modified wave function in that even though we had a starting point where you're getting almost nothing in return or very limited return, you're not ever going to go back to that point, or at least that's the way it was cycle one. That means that you stay in profitability to the end. You just see that your peak profitability is sometime, the way it worked out was about 3/4 of the way through, at least for the Dragonfly, and then seeing it come back down and then coming back up again. So there was a reason to continue to participate till the end of the curve. We saw in the sharp step the same thing, sharp step, mild step, same thing, where we would have an input in the beginning where you're putting a higher input in, then you were getting an output in each of the intervals, so first, second, third, fourth. But on the steps, you would get to a point where poop, it would come up, and then for a couple intervals, it would have the same output. Then again, it would increase. You have a couple intervals with the same output, and eventually you gain your highest profits at the end. So like the toucan, you might have had the last 3 intervals. I think that was the last 3 intervals had the same output, and that was your maximum payout for those 3 intervals. You had the previous couple intervals and the previous couple intervals prior to that, you were profitable as well. It just wasn't as profitable. So we did see the pattern, how that pattern played out. Again, we could see that the point at which each of these curves shifts from a lack of profitability in intervals to a profitable interval, that could happen at different times of the month. The apex of the maximum output, the maximum profitability on a wave function, that may change, or when it is in the month, that may change. It's possible that could change. But knowing the way these functioned in the first quarter, it gives us a better idea of what to expect, and that is profitability strongly centered between the last third, or amongst the last third of the month, is where people start to see their profitability happen, which means you can't give up early in the month. You have to avoid penalties early in the month, and we'll get into where those penalties come from. But you have to avoid penalties early in the month, and you have to just finish it out. You can't give up after 2 weeks, because now you're just at a complete loss. Again, the better you are, the closer you are to perfect in the first 3 weeks, the better those profits are at the end here. So color, key here with color, and as mentioned with the how do I know how much to feed? It's a great question. It was a question, a reason why these third-party tools existed in the first place. But the question, the answer to how much do I feed, is actually going to be determined by two of these attributes. See, we have color, which is giving us the attribute of input, and having an attribute of input tells you overall how much is going to be fed. If it's going to tell you overall what how much is going to be fed, that's coming from style. But the requirement, or the idea of how much am I feeding per feeding, is created by frequency, because ultimately frequency is telling us we have to feed every so many hours. Am I feeding every 8 hours like I was with an orange in the first cycle? Again, potential to change in the second cycle. Or am I feeding every 24 hours like I had with green? Again, potential to change in the second cycle, but something that made the greens very easy to work with. You feed them at the same time every day. Ultimately, the reason why frequency was also important in how much you were feeding in is your frequency essentially divided the total amount of input that you were doing in the month. The total amount of input was determined by style. So what we ended up seeing in a lot of cases, or what a lot of people saw, was if I looked at my color gives me an indication of how much I'm feeding per cycle, per interval. That's because that's a division of the overall input, which, go figure, the input overall for the entire month or the entire cycle is not that different between the different styles. We'll get into that. We'll take a quick look. But um, the ultimately the bigger variance, the bigger deviation is how long those frequencies are, because some of those frequencies, again, feeding every 8 hours versus on the far side, feeding every close to 48 hours. If you're further to feeding once every 2 days versus feeding 3 times a day, that's going to have a bigger determinative effect as to how much is getting fed each cycle as a divisible denominator. So that's a key point there, and definitely worth keeping in mind. As we move into the next cycle, your color, if you want to coordinate with the same colors, if you want to feed every 8 hours, if you want to feed more or less often, obviously keep that in mind. Usually something like a 24-hour cycle makes it easy because you don't have your timing move it across the map. Same thing with a brown, which was 12 hours. Same thing with an orange, which is 8 hours. It's the same points every day. Again, 8 hours puts you feeding 3 times a day. 12 hours puts you feeding twice a day, but it's the same point of feeding every single day throughout the month, as opposed to some feeding cycles, which are, let's say, set like a red on a 30-hour cycle, meaning on a 30-hour cycle, we are seeing that time, the optimal feed time, is going to change each interval, meaning it's easier to get lost and forget about it. And hey, last time I fed it at 2 o'clock, guess what? This time, a day and a half later, I'm feeding at 4 o'clock or 6 o'clock. Again, that 30 hours is going to be 6 hours later in the next day. Essentially, is when you're going to be looking at feeding. So with that moving across the clock, that might not be the easiest thing for people to keep up with or keep in mind. So that is why ultimately color is probably the biggest determinative factor. Again, it determines what the overall feeding amount was, or the amount to be fed each interval, the optimal feed per interval. It determines that as being the denominator, the dividing factor. So that is key there. That we know our color and that we manage it. We choose the color that works best for us if we can. If you're in the process of trading right now, you may want to move into a single color. It makes it easier. One feeding cycle to keep track of throughout the month. And again, style is still important. The style sets the overall input for the month. And again, there was some question on this up front. If you haven't been keeping track, if you're new to Totems, just make it easy. There are only a few different styles, 7 different styles. Of the 7 different styles, there is a variation from, I think, 1,000 to 1,600 is what it was in cycle 1. We'll take a look at the actual data here real quick when I look at one of the tools. But with that small deviation, or that limited scaling difference between the least to the most, lowest to the highest, on the size of variation, on the consideration of variations for style, for the input, the max input amounts. This is a smaller determinative effect, of course, than the color. But what it ultimately looks like is a lot of our totems, regardless of style, are going to have similar inputs, total inputs over the course of the month. That doesn't mean they're going to get fed each feeding the same. That's going to be more determined by how long those intervals are, because, again, it's a matter of what's your overall feeding for the month. This animal, this totem that Upland has decided is going to be something we're going to feed with Protem. It's going to need 1,600 Protem over the course of the month. Now we're going to divide that 1,600 over, either you get it over 30 feedings, or you get it over 10 feedings. You get it over, if you get to an orange, or the way things worked out for the first cycle, 3 times a day over the course of 30 days, you're looking at 90 cycles, 90 intervals inside that single cycle. So with that in mind, You need to know both these factors in order to make this work. And the good news is, and I'm going to make that segue very shortly, the good news is people have already done that for you. That is how the math was determined. The idea of, am I hitting the sweet spot? Once you can correlate, am I hitting the sweet spot by looking at a number of people with the same color and then correlating that with the style, it was pretty easy math to figure out, okay, so the style determines blank. Again, what my overall input amount for the month is this 1,600? Is this 1,000? Is this 1,200? And then obviously, very easily, very quickly, you find your optimal feed cycle on the color side, where you're looking at your interval and you're saying, okay, this is the 8-hour interval as opposed to a 12-hour, as opposed to 24 hours, as opposed to a 30-hour interval. Knowing those two things, that's all you need to know how to feed. That's the biggest and the keyest thing. Knowing that your life form is going to tell you when you get fed, when you get paid out, knowing that your profitability is going to be set towards the end. If you just feed the right amount at the right time throughout the entire month, don't miss a single cycle. And I'll get into the idea of penalty here. You have a little bit of grace period. If you're a little early or a little late on your optimal, that's not as big of an issue. What the issue is feeding outside of the interval. You have to feed once per interval. You feed twice in the interval, you wasted a feeding. You feed not at all during an interval, and you may end up with a penalty for missing a feeding for your interval for your totem. Again, these are meant to represent animals. They're not actually alive. They're totems. So we'll leave life off the table because we're not quite there yet. And then scale. Our scale is important as well. It's not as important as it could be, or as some of the other features. If you're going to be logging in to go and do all the other things, you just have to make sure you're collecting Protem. Your capacity is the amount of Protem that can hold and store. There's a question that's come up with this, though, and it's important to think about as of today, as we start thinking about cycle 2, is we know the majority of the profits come at the end of the month. We know that if we're looking at something that has a hockey stick model, for example, if I was looking at my cheetah, I might be only inputting 20 Protem, and that might be that might be each interval. That's like an orange or brown, where I put in 20, 30 Protem in, or between 15 and 30 Protem in. But I get to that last interval, and I might be getting 250, 300 Protem back, which is great. But when Upland sets these capacities, they have to keep that in mind, that each feeding along the way, each interval along the way, has a different output. You can't set a capacity that's going to mean that your actual profitability period, which is your last couple intervals, it's going to exceed that storage amount. So we still have that question. We have that question because the capacity wasn't really turned on in the first cycle. So we didn't really see how that played into the whole story. Once that's turned on in a real broad way, we're going to likely get that figured out. The people who put out the tools are going to likely figure it out. The only thing I'm going to put out there is, let's have it work the first time. If capacity is kicking somebody out and saying, oops, you had a single feeding you missed, or a single payout you missed, or your single payout that you are coming to collect exceeds the amount we can store, so you don't actually get the profitability, it just can't be the case. It just can't be the case. Again, your capacity can't be 180 if the payout's going to be 250. Again, you can't penalize somebody for going to collect 2 seconds after the payout happened. I get the point of capacity where you can't leave it building up there over hours, over 6 intervals, and you haven't collected over 6 intervals. I get that. Collect at the right time. Collect within an hour and a half or 3 hours of when the payout was. That's fine. Upland do that. We just want to make sure that the capacity isn't set in such a way that it penalizes people for having a bad capacity. And I do want to touch on these since I mentioned they're scaled here. So with sizing, with scale here, we're going from micro to epic. Obviously, micro is going to be the smallest capacity. That's the smallest amount that you can store. Epic is going to be the largest, so the least penalty for people, or the least likely to penalize people for leaving things uncollected. And then everything steps up in the middle, right? Micro, small, normal, medium, large, extra large, huge, gigantic, epic. Pretty simple, pretty easy for that to scale up. Again, this will be the first time we see that for scale to be important in the game of totems. And the bases, I talked about that we do have penalizations. We have penalties. These penalties come at the end of the cycle. And the reason why penalties matter, and they definitely played a pretty big role for many people the first cycle. The reason why penalties matter is, as I mentioned, penalties can be accrued throughout the entire cycle. They get refreshed. It's etch a sketch. You lose your penalties. Your penalties reset in the next cycle. That's good. However, since the maximum payout, since the best profitability is at the end of the cycle, that's what we're going to see as being the most significant. That's what we're going to see as when we want to have the least penalties. And since penalties accrue, that's when you're going to have the most penalties of the month. You made mistakes once on day 1, once on day 5, once on day 6. Those all built up for you. So the way that the penalties exist is there's 4 different archetypes of penalties. These are set up with different variations here: hexagonal base, pentagonal base, square base, and circle base. And again, with these bases, we have a different penalty for each. With hexagonal bases, we ended up having a penalty that was percent yield reduction for each payout based on how many you missed, how many feeds you missed. Pentagonal, we had a payout reduction in the form of shortening cycles. You had less intervals left in the month. So if you miss 3 feeds, you may be having the last 3 intervals of your month clipped right off. People saw with the pentagonal that people saw their overall month cycle when your cycle ended shortened. They did not have their cycle last as long. Square essentially is a little bit different. You don't have any penalty the first misfeeding. You don't have any penalty the second, third, fourth, fifth. The 6th misfeeding, done deal. Your cycle is done. So with a square, we did see a couple of these. I happened to have a square. I happened to miss 6 feedings. It was a orange. Orange was being fed 3 times a day. In the beginning, it was unclear. There were some things, easy ways to get missed. I had not found the perfect tool that told me, hey, feed at this time, this time, this time. And it saves you from having to keep your own spreadsheets. It saves you from having to keep your own calendars. The tools are great and beautiful, and I'll get into the one that I used during the cycle. But until you get those tools established, until you know the exact time of feeding, it's easy to miss feeds, especially on the shorter cycles. So you end up with a orange orange where you're feeding all the time. It happens to be on a square base. You could have that die, or let's say it in an easier way, go into hibernation later in your cycle before you get to profitability. So let's not have that happen. So watch out with the squares, of course, and circles. Circle is the best bonus. It's a bonus, I should say. It's the best option. Essentially means that you don't get any penalty. So if I know that I'm profitable at the end of the month and I've got a circle base, I can sit on my hands until I know that I'm in profitability, and then I feed. And with that feed, I'm going to be unprofitable because I'm in the profitable portion of that cycle. That's the interesting thing that we saw with these cycles is the cycle is what it is. The output curve is the output curve. So it doesn't say, have I fed 15 times in a row? Now my 15th feed is profitable. It says I'm on interval 17. On interval 17, I have this payout curve. Inputs here, outputs here. Day 1, inputs here, outputs down below it. So that's something to keep in mind. There are ways of gaming the system. Again, it is a game. It is meant to be a gamification of Upland. People deciding strategically not to feed. Again, with a circle base, I can understand that. You got to be careful with any of the other bases, quote unquote, strategically not feeding, because you want to avoid building those penalties. And the other form of strategically not feeding we can definitely put out here is also tied into, or can be tied into, penalties as well. And that is the idea of underfeeding, strategically underfeeding knowing you're supposed to feed a certain amount, feeding less than that, getting less than your interval payout. The good news is, or what appears to be the case from the first cycle, I hope it doesn't change, but it doesn't appear to be the case in the first cycle, is there's no long-term penalty for underfeeding during a cycle. Essentially, if I know I'm supposed to feed 15 Protem, and I choose to feed one Protem, I'm going to get paid less that interval than I would if I paid the 15. I'm going to get paid scaled on the fact that I only gave one Protem. That means I'm unlikely to get a significant yield. I mean, obviously, the game's built around feeding the optimal amount, getting a significant yield at the profitability, at the high profitability points at the end of the month. That's where you're really starting to stack that Protem. That's the way the cycle's built. But if you know you're in a non-profitable period of the month because you've figured out the cycles and you're very confident in the cycle you're in, hint, hint, wink, wink, nod, nod, we aren't confident in the way life forms, or that life forms are going to operate exactly the same way next cycle. Keep that in mind. But if we know that, if we've got an establishment where we're pretty confident, where we know where our yield curves are, and we know that we're at a significant loss in the yield curve, you may be in a position where if you feed that one Protem, you're not getting as much yield at that interval as if you had fed a higher amount. However, since you're going to take a loss anyways, you're taking a lower loss. Then you get to a point where you're going to be breaking even. Then you want to feed the correct amount. The ideal situation, or what appears to be the ideal situation, is never miss a feeding. Feed at the time you're supposed to, or about the time you're supposed to, once per interval. Get throughout the month. Feed the right amounts when you're in the profitability area. And if you feed less, again, this was something that was experimented on the first cycle, could change the second cycle. Caveat there, we'll watch as we go. But the first cycle showed us that if we underfed, we would get less during that interval, and then we would just be able to focus on our profitability. And again, this would have bumped your profitability a little bit by doing so. So that's pretty easy, pretty simple there. Again, I know there's a lot of different variables here, and the inspiration, again, of going back and looking at totems was twofold. Number one is we are a little bit in between our first and second cycle. We don't know exactly when the second one starts, but there were people with takeaways from the first. And the second portion was there's still people who are asking questions about, how do I feed, or when, or discussing the fact that when we started at the beginning of the first cycle, we had no clue. We had no clue because Upland made it a mystery intentionally, and they want us to figure it out. And I think Upland had this concept that there would be tools and people would put tools out, and that there would be blockchain scraping and people would be putting the work in to make it easier. So I don't think that was a surprise that it happened, but it was great for the community. And with that note, with that idea of, why or how do we get around this idea of, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm fumbling around in the dark, my fingertips are scraping the walls, I can't see anything. How do we get around that? A couple of the tools that have worked well have been put out by people who have done other things in the community. Buellman has done other things with other info in the game of Upland. My upland.info is the site where I'm looking at right now, and this is essentially the easiest way that I found to work with totems. Look at this, totems. Easiest way that I found to work with totems. And the great news is, if I had a buddy and I want to go feed his, I really can go and see this here. A couple takeaways on feeding someone else's totem. I'll give you a real quick aside. I had discussed this penalty for underfeeding. The penalty for underfeeding is that particular interval, you do not get the maximum output. It's scaled based on what you feed. I mentioned that you want to feed once per cycle because you don't want to get the penalty that is increasing towards the end of the cycle, which could either affect the output of each interval going forward, or shorten your overall cycle for the month, or disqualify you altogether. But there's one more penalty. That penalty is lost Protem for overfeeding. That means you fed too much, you fed it twice in the same cycle, whatever the case is. Here's the thing. People see this as this big, scary, oh, anyone can feed my totem. What's going to happen if somebody maliciously feeds my totem? Well, ultimately, probably nothing. If I were to go on here and I were to go look up, like I mentioned, the this idea of the llama that is owned by Ken Conroy, and I went and fed his llama, and you fed his llama, and the next guy fed this llama, and Tina down the street fed his llama. That llama would have a lot of food right in front of it, but it would only eat so much, and then its payout would be based on what it ate. Feeding 4 times in the same interval is not going to affect the second interval. You fed 16 times in interval 1. Interval 2 still starts when it starts. It still requires feeding at a approximate time, and it still wants to look to get fed a certain amount. If I feed more than what the certain amount is that it wants to be fed, that's just wasted. That's essentially I fed too much. It goes, it's essentially chaff in the air. It goes, flies up, it's gone. If I feed twice, same thing. It's extra food in the bin. That llama's not going to eat it. It's going to wait till next interval before it's hungry. It's going to eat again, but that food's all gone by the time you get to the next interval. The trough gets emptied every start of each interval. Think about that as your food or as your protein being discarded. It's wasted. So you're not going to have long-term effects by overfeeding in one interval. You're not going to have overall long-term effects by feeding too much. But what you end up doing is wasting that, which means it's going to affect your overall profitability for the month. So if somebody does it to you, they're just wasting their own protein. They're not affecting you. They're not harming you. Just as long as you had one feed during the cycle of the appropriate feed or more. Again, the more is not going to negatively affect you in the output. It's just going to be wasted. Then you're going to be in good shape. You're going to be able to get your maximum payout towards the end of the month. So when I look at this tool and I look here, like I mentioned, I can look and see if I wanted to do so, I can go right here and I can look and see how much this totem wants to be fed. And I can see that this is a fluid style. This is pretty cool. The fluid style, like we discussed, so this style is going to determine how much the overall input is over the course of the month. I happen to have a scale down here to give me that information. I have the life form as llama, so I know that my llama is going to feed me out each interval throughout the month. It's going to feed me out each interval the same output as the input. Okay, great. It is a epic scale, so it has the largest capacity if I did not collect the output. It is round base, so there's no penalties if I miss feedings. That's good. And because it is because it is a gold right here, color gold, it gets fed once every 48 hours. Once every 2 days, that's easy to remember. Again, this is the best totem. Makes sense. Best totem is gonna have the best features once every 48 hours. Because it doesn't get fed as often, once every 2 days, essentially, what we're gonna see is that the fluid right here, the fluid style, indicating 1600 overall input of protem over the course of the month of the cycle, divided by feeding every other day, means I'm going to have a decent input that I have to go and put in there. Keep in mind, the 30-day cycle means 15 feedings. 15 feedings divided by, or the 1600 total feeding amount, the total input amount divided by the 15 feedings is going to tell us that we're going to be feeding about 110 each time we have to go and feed. Pretty easy, pretty simple, nothing crazy. So that's what the feeding is going to be. If I come down here to tell me about my feeding, I'm going to see it tells me my feed amount is 106.67 protem. I said 110. I rounded up. 106.67 protem is the feed per feeding. Okay, great. The number of days in the cycle is going to be 30. Great. And as we said, 15 total feedings. We can see that it was fed. Good job on you. Took a little bit for them to figure out the feed cycle, but it looks like that all got taken care of. And pretty simple. Here's your feeding sweet spot. It tells you your time for your feeding, when you should feed. As I mentioned, there's an interval start, there's an interval end. The key thing is to feed at least once between the interval start and interval end to not accumulate penalties if you have them. Again, this is a round base, no penalties. If it was a pentagonal, if it was a hexagonal, if it was a square base, we would care about missing feedings. It would be more of an issue. So if we want to make sure we feed once between this interval start and interval end, we're going to be in good shape to not have major penalties towards the end of the month. And the feeding sweet spot essentially just helps you make sure that you're feeding towards the middle, um, getting maximum output, and that may be turned on in a little different way the second cycle, but feeding closer to the midpoint on each of those intervals is what is being recommended. And if I'm using this particular tool is myupland.info. I also see here with the how did I spend? When did I spend last? And how much did I spend? It's a great part of that tool in that if I forgot when I last fed, I can come and see when I last fed. I can see how much I fed. So if I underfed, overfed. And of course, if I come back here and look at the basics, it's telling me how often to feed right here, 48 hours. It's telling me how much to feed. It's reiterating the maximum amount of protem, the total protem I'm going to input over the course of the month. And pretty simple, pretty easy. I can follow those things. That's a lot easier than what Upland gave us in the first place. And it does tie everything together. Like I said, the color and the style, hand in hand. That color is important. It helps tell us what each of those individual feeds are. The style, essentially our style, having the rarest side of style, the fluid, is just going to mean that you have more protem you have to put in over the course of the month, which means you get more protem out at the end. So if you have a fluid, if it's an option to you, you may want it more in, more out. With a more in, keep in mind that we saw with some of the protems as people are feeding them with that 555, that 555 protem that we were dropped for each of our totems, that actually lasted differently for different folks, but depending on three things. What was your life form? Essentially determining how quickly you get to a profit. Again, color, so how often you were feeding, and again, style with the overall amount that was being fed. So ultimately, that 555 was scaled so that everybody, if they fed perfectly, they would never go to zero. They would never go to a point where they were out of protem if they were perfect. Of course, if you made a mistake, if you overfed, if you fed too often, you definitely could end up in a position where you ran out of protem. And that's an important point I want to make. If you are in the position where you do not own a totem currently, and you're considering going into cycle 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you want to participate in them, you can buy a totem to do so. If you don't have any protem to start with, then you're going to have to get some protem. Where are you going to get protem? Upland did protem sales in the first cycle. Upland has said they will do it again. And the concept is they are doing a sale where you buy UPX for USD as a sweetener, as a bonus. You're getting protem as a bonus. So keep that in mind. It looks like Upland's going to do that again. You do have the ability to go into cycle 2, 3, and 4, participate 2, 3, 4, and 5. As somebody who hasn't participated before, you just have to come up with that protem as well. So keep that in your budget. You're going to have to buy some protem. And as I said, if you don't have enough protem per totem, I said Upland dropped 555 per totem. I said that was essentially not required for all totems, but with some totems, you ended up with a point where you would have gone pretty close to negative with that 555. Again, some totems, not as much of an issue with. So with that in mind, if you're going to go and buy some totems, you may want to have about 500 plus or minus 500 protem per totem, because we know that we're going to have the less profitable portions up front. So you have to weather that storm before you start taking profits. As mentioned, if you underfeed during underperforming periods, it does seem that doesn't give you any major penalty long term. It does seem that's a good strategy to reduce your costs in getting to the end towards the actual profitability period. That is a strategy for people to consider and keep in mind. But if you are feeding the optimal amount, the full amount every feeding, like I did, you could go ahead and be pretty safe, mostly safe at 500 protem per totem. so that that's your budget. You have to consider that you have to pick up some Protem as you get started with cycles 2 getting started, and you need to keep in mind, obviously, if you're looking at fluid, if you're looking at something with a hockey stick, like a cheetah, you're going to be probably closer to needing that 500. Otherwise, you'll go negative. So keep that in mind. Pretty easy, pretty simple, and it's definitely worth worth the consideration if you are going to come into the Protem game, come into the Totem game, and not have been in for the first cycle of the period of time. That's about it. I mean, the only other things that I want to put out on Totems, and I've said it before, and I kind of hint it and drop it and keep my mind on it, is cycle 2, 3, 4, and 5 aren't necessarily the same as cycle 1. What that means is we could see some of the features or some of the scaling change. We're still going to be able to go here and look at life form and know that we have the curve that we had in cycle 1. Those curves, or the archetype of those curves, they should be the same for the same totems. The color, what we're going to see is that orange is going to be the shortest cycle and gold is going to be the longest cycle. Or we should use the word interval there. The interval, your interval of time for your orange for each feed interval is going to be the shortest for orange, longest for gold, brown, purple, green, red, and blue, scale in between. When I look at style, we know that style is going to determine our overall input amount. Again, the highest, lowest input amount, not doubling, going from 1,000 to 1,600 on the first cycle, or in the first cycle. So we're gonna see the same thing, where elegant is going to be the least, or the lowest, 1,000, and fluid is going to be the 1,600 over the course. So that's a consideration worth keeping. That scale may change. It might be elegant, might be 1,200, 1,300, 1,400, and fluid being 16. I don't expect them to take fluid and make it 3,200 input. In that, that would significantly change the amount of Protem to run through the month, run through the cycle. Who knows? Maybe I'm surprised. I have a pile of Protem that's much larger than I started with, so I could afford for the cost to be higher if the outputs are going to be higher. Except if I were coming in new, if I was someone who's brand new, I would need to go and purchase more Protem for that to be the case. So again, if Upland's going to play around with that overall input over the course of the cycle, hopefully that's telegraphed in a certain way to tell people who may have burnt through their Protem, may not have had a profitable first cycle, may have picked up Totems to be ready for the second cycle, but don't have Protem. Giving them a better idea of planning and preparing and what's different in cycle 2 than cycle 1. And the other thing that I want to put out there with Totems is, and just a reminder, I kind of put it out there in many ways, is this idea that it is a concentrated effort throughout the month. It is not something worth losing sleep over or having health issues or concerns. It was very profitable for me, based on the basics of the cycle for me. I had 7 Totem. I murdered one of them accidentally, or it went on hibernation or hiatus, or took a strike, or whatever it happened. It wasn't giving me output for the last part of the month. But even being down to 6 from 7, even not being perfect and picking up some penalties along the way, I got 2 times my input back as a profit. So I ended up with over 3 times what my original was. The original was 3,800, was dropped. I ended up with 10,400. So almost 3 times at the end of what I had started with, which I think is good. I think that to give a value to Protem, again, we don't have it. It's going to turn into STEM based on the buying amount, the fact that the Totems were available for $55 USD or 55,000 UPEX, being that I'm throwing that number out, that this crazy number of about 15,000 UPEX is the value of or $15, $12 to $15, 12 to 15,000 UPEX is the value that Upland ascribed to the statue itself, to the map asset itself, and the rest was a value for that original Totem drop of 555. The reason why I ascribe that amount is because that is the amount when Upland's selling at essentially $15, 12 and a half, $15, when they're selling these map assets that have these limited utilities. So theoretically, you could say they're saying about 12 to 15,000 is the value on the little map asset, and that means the rest, about 40,000 plus or minus UPX, 40 USD is the way Upland had set that. 40,000 UPX is the value of the Protem you got. You've got 550 Protem for 40,000 UPX. I can come back and I can value my Protem that I ended up at the end with over 600,000 UPX value. I don't think it's a bad calculation for myself as a profit. If that's what I'm getting out at the end, I'm not going to complain or cry about that. Again, the actual value, there isn't a 1-for-1 because you never bought them. You got it as a bonus. Keep that in mind. You got it as a bonus when you did a USD specific sale to buy to go and buy something for the UPX purchase, and then you get Protem back as a bonus. That was the other way that it was acquired, other than just buying a Protem and a Totem and holding it until the Protem drop. But the ultimate takeaway is do this because you have the time and you want to. That penalty for not feed at the exact minute, that's not the biggest penalty in the overall cycle. If you are going to feed at least once per interval, if you can't feed right in the middle because it's during your sleep cycle, but you can feed an hour and a half or 2 hours or 3 hours before the end of that interval, do that. You can still get a profit. You can still be profitable. You can still have fun, and you will be healthier. You'll be healthier, not missing sleep all the time. So I hope that we can do this a little more regulated next cycle. I know Upland wanted to make it a game. They wanted to make it a little bit of difficult. They wanted to put a little bit of a learning curve in there. I think we had it, but I'm glad that we've got a lot of those things solved. And I hope that a lot of people can make it an easier part of their life for the next cycle as it gets announced. And with that, we have no other major news in the game of Upland for today. So I did want to put that out there. I did want to put it on the record. This is kind of a little bit of my takeaway from Totems at a time where we are getting ready to start thinking about cycle 2. That'll be announced without any evidence, without any reason to know this. I have a pretty good feeling that Upland's going to let the rest of February come to an end with the Totem cycle 2 likely starting beginning of March. And part of the reason why I kind of put my fingers crossed and assume that is A, we're halfway through the month of February. B, there wasn't 30 days in February. There's 30 days. There's more than 30 days in March. We can theoretically have a good start cycle. And again, Upland take a little time to recalibrate, look over data, do whatever they want to do between these Totem cycles. Maybe doing this 1 month on, 1 month off. Maybe that's something that they want to do for the cycle of the game. And knowing that we have other things going on, we had seasons get kicked up this month. We had gamified earnings start this month. It gives opportunity for the focus to be kind of on that gamified earnings during that period of time. And then obviously let the Totems come back. Let that be an important part of the game. Let that be a focus here for the upcoming month. Fingers crossed that's what we're going to see. And with that, I will say thank you so much for tonight. Tonight, it was the 15th. My time zones put me into the 16th, but it was the 15th of February, 2024. Looking forward to seeing you all, maybe modified tomorrow the 16th, in that I will be on the road. I may not be able to get StreamYard to work as well with technology, but hoping to see you all at least on Monday, if not sooner. 7 p.m. PT, Monday through Friday, here in the cafe, in Discord, and also on YouTube. You could always watch recorded from there. And as I always like to end things, if you are in the Discord, please feel free to unmute your mics. The floor is yours.